John Fund, Todd Wood by phone, and Bill Gertz is in the house. So we're ready to go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Tuesday afternoon for our webinar, live webcast, dealing with issues related to the Korean Peninsula and Northeastern Asian security. And as always, we're always dealing with our technology here. So we have in the house Mr. Bill Gertz and John Fund, who's in an airport waiting room. So we're going to let him go first. And then we have Todd Wood, who is on by phone. So, but if you're here, you're here. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Michael Jenkins, who's chairman of Universal Peace Federation North America and also president of the co-sponsor of this webinar, the Washington Times Foundation, chairman of Washington Times Holdings, and which is the owner of the Washington Times. He's been active on many peace initiatives in Northeast Asia and in the Middle East. Welcome, Dr. Jenkins. It's all yours.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you to all of our audience for coming in for this special webinar. I'd like to just share with you for a moment a couple of things about the background on this wonderful program that we're about to have. The Universal Peace Federation is partnering with the Washington Times Foundation on this webinar, Getting the Story Covering Asia. And we have distinguished panelists today. We have Mr. John Fund, Todd Wood, and also Mr. Bill Gertz. And just for some background, years ago in 2015, the Washington Times had a special fact-finding trip to Korea in 2015. And we have done fact-finding trips since that time together with the Washington Times, about 3 per year for the last 6 years. And it's been a tremendous experience, and it's developed a tremendous amount of coverage in various media throughout Korea and the United States. We also went up to the DMZ with about 70 journalists were with us from various mainstream media in the United States. Some of our panel was on that trip also. In fact, you can see Mr. Gertz right here in the middle. This is at Panmunjom. And Colonel Minnick there is looking at the window because somebody was looking at us through the window. There's Guy Taylor and Dr. Manzaroff here and Mr. Tom McDivitt, chairman of the Washington Times. But when you go to Panmunjom, especially if you've got a high-level delegation, they always have North Koreans that come and want to look in from their side of the Panmunjom and try to understand who's there and film us. So it was a wonderful experience to learn firsthand and feel the tensions there. Here's the delegation that went with us. We went on to various other, also Bill Gertz got his camera out so he could make sure he could film our visitors. Congressmen came, we had defectors from North Korea brief us. This particular person was an expert in teaching how to a large number, I forget the number exactly, Bill Gertz would know, but a large number of military personnel. He was the one that was teaching them how to hack. And he was very, very informative, but he eventually had a very bad experience, was imprisoned in North Korea and has lost his any kind of feeling of staying there. So he left and came to South Korea. And we had television programs and we had seminars and we had a wonderful trip to the National Assembly. And this has gone on 3 times a year, every year. And we're going to be doing this once a month from now because we feel this moment in Korea is critically important. And it's a very special time right now. And really journalists are the ones that need to open the way. So at this, I'd like to turn to Mr. John Fund. And I'd like to just introduce him briefly for a moment. John is the national affairs columnist for the National Review magazine and a contributor to Fox News. He's often quoted as an expert on politics and the interconnection between politics, economics, and legal issues. He previously served as a columnist and editorial board member of the Wall Street Journal for 27 years. He's the author of several books, Roll Call, The Newspaper, or worked for Roll Call, the newspaper Capitol Hill of Capitol Hill. Roll Call called him. Oh, I'm sorry. Roll Call, the newspaper of Capitol Hill, called him Tom Paine of the modern congressional reform movement. At this time, I'd like to present Mr. John Fund. Welcome, John.
Well, thank you. But if I'm the Tom Paine of the modern congressional reform movement, there hasn't been much reform, so I haven't succeeded nearly as much as I'd hoped. It is a pleasure to be with the foundation. My memories of the 2015 fact-finding mission are extremely fond. It was a very valuable experience. I had tried 3 or 4 times to enter North Korea to do reporting there. They turned me down every time. I was told informally through diplomatic channels that they could walk through their deepest confidence that I would tell their side of the story and not get their ankles wet. So I consider that almost a badge of honor. But I do believe that peace and understanding between the two halves of Korea is very necessary. So while we certainly must understand the strategic challenge and the strategic difficulty that North Korea poses, we also have to understand that in a country divided, there must be contacts and there must be, as much as possible, a peaceful settlement of all the grievances. Having said all of this, reporting from Asia, I've reported from 7 countries in Asia, is a challenge. One of the challenges, of course, is cultural. The media in Asia is not quite as open or as responsive to First Amendment issues as we would have in this country. There is a lot of self-censorship in some countries, sometimes overt censorship. I vividly recall visiting Hong Kong. This was a few years ago. And I remember one of the things I prepared for the trip to doing was to visit the Free to Choose website, which was the television show that Milton Friedman had done, in which he celebrated the freedom of Hong Kong. And he mentioned that the lesson of Hong Kong is that political and economic freedoms are indivisible, and that Hong Kong's political freedom was very important, so too was its economic freedom, and they were bound together. And we have seen that in recent days, and I think this is one of the biggest uncovered stories right now in Asia, whereby we know about the political crackdown of the Communist Chinese government on Hong Kong. What we don't know is how the Hong Kong economic freedom, which of course has led to one of the most prosperous economies in the world, is now being challenged. Apparently, anyone who dissents from the view that Hong Kong has to be part of mainland China, has to kowtow to mainland China, and has to follow its wishes, can not only be punished with a loss of political freedoms, but also economic freedoms. Apparently, if you leave Hong Kong to seek employment or a new life abroad, they will seize your bank account. They will freeze it, and they will take other measures to make sure that you can't take anything with you. This kind of totalitarian tactic is, of course, a complete abnegation of Hong Kong's treaty that was signed in 1997 between Great Britain and Communist China. And it just shows how precious and fragile freedom can be. So I will just say that I'm very pleased that the foundation is
We'll just wait till he unfreezes.
Yeah, I think he doesn't know that he's frozen.
Let's give him a moment. Hopefully John will come right back. It's a little technical. challenge here. All right. Hopefully John will be able to make it back, but we really appreciate his work as a outstanding journalist known throughout America and the world. We really appreciate his insights and understanding. If he comes back, we'll have a couple questions for him. At this time, I'd like to introduce
Oh,
Mr.
he's in. He
Oh,
came
okay.
in. Looks like he's in the waiting room.
Okay, welcome back, John.
EJ's letting him in now, I think.
Okay, good.
I'm sorry for the bad connection. I
No
had basically concluded my remarks, and I was just going to say that I believe that much of the understanding that can be gleaned from the Korean Peninsula or from publications like the Washington Times, which follow it so carefully.
John, just a couple quick questions. In your 3 decades career as a commentator, you've undoubtedly ruffled a few feathers. Do you have to deal with government or personal pushback? Also, is there a new hostility in today's political climate? Are we in a different era now?
Are you speaking of covering Asian
Yeah.
countries? Oh,
Yeah.
well, the situation in Asia is very mixed. I recently wrote an article about the Philippines, which I think has the most severe COVID pandemic lockdown in the world. And the government there is frankly almost irrational in its hatred and suspicion of the media. The media in the Philippines is under grave peril, and so too are the people. Suicides, depression, all of the concomitant effects of a lockdown are to be seen there. In China, I'm continued to, I was astonished over the years at how much the Chinese were able to get away with telling the biggest whoppers and have them credulously reported in the Western press. I think that's finally changed. In fact, President Biden's own national security team has said, Donald Trump did do some good things in foreign policy, not only in the Middle East, but in China. He weaned us away from the influence of the communist Chinese lobby in Washington, where you could see no evil, speak no evil, and hear no evil about what the Chinese were doing. And I would just say that the biggest challenge in China is their statistics. We know that they underreported and misreported the pandemic. We know that there were far more cases of COVID than they reported. And I think that one of the biggest challenges going forward in Asia is cracking the mysterious secrecy that shrouds and surrounds everything coming out of China.
John, one final question very quickly. If a young person wants to be a journalist today, what course should they take in school, not counting journalism? What would you recommend?
Well, my answer is now different than it would have been 20 years ago. I have good news and bad news. The good news is now everyone can be a journalist. The opportunities to blog, the opportunities to do podcasts, the opportunities to be on multiple platforms rather than just being hired by one company are endless. The problem is, of course, that print media is dying. And of course, the advertising revenue that used to support print media has not been replaced one for one in the digital world. So I would say the good news is anyone can be a citizen journalist, anyone can be a part-time journalist, anyone can combine journalism now with another career or another position easier than ever before in history. The problem is if you wish to be a full-time journalist and make that your only job, employment opportunities are much slimmer, much more limited, and frankly, the pay is not nearly as good as it used to be. So I think that journalism, if you want to make it a part-time vocation, is flourishing. If you want to make it a full-time vocation, you either have to be very, very good, very, very lucky, or very imaginative in this new digital world.
John, we thank you. We're very fortunate to have you, our national affairs columnist for the National Review, and safe travels to you.
A pleasure.
And thank you.
Thank you.
At this time, I'd like to turn to Mr. Todd Wood. Todd is an outstanding journalist who also is a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy. As Special Operations Helicopter pilot, Todd flew counterterrorism missions for SEAL Team 6 and Delta Force globally under the National Command Authority. After a long career on Wall Street, trading emergency market debt, Todd focused on journalism and writing. A successful novelist and national security columnist, Wood founded CDMedia in 2015 and a fast-growing global media outlet for which he serves as CEO, publisher, and editor, and he's a columnist for the Washington Times quite a bit. Let's welcome Mr. L. Todd Wood.
Well, thank you very much. First, I'd like to piggyback on what John said. The 2015 trip was extremely rewarding, amazing, and educational. I still have relationships today with multiple journalists and other officials that I met over there that I still utilize. So kudos to the Washington Times for putting that together those years ago. And the trip to the DMZ was amazing. The topic of this talk, I was told, is how to get the story. So I thought I'd just put a short few notes together on how, we have reporters all over the world, Eastern Europe, Middle East, Asia, and this is a problem that we constantly have to deal with. So for someone who's getting into journalism, the first thing I would say is travel, travel, travel. Come to the location you want to be an expert in, immerse yourself in the culture, build relationships, really go native, if you will, and build the trust with people on the ground. And John is right. You don't need to be an official journalist. There are millions of citizen journalists, and we get more stories just with someone with an iPhone on the street than we do from stringers or actual journalists in country. And that has become extremely valuable. When you build these relationships with sources overseas, I would make sure you follow through on your promises, that you protect the sources if they want to be protected, that you take controlled risk, meaning you go into areas maybe with a security team or maybe with people that you trust and then know the area. But also you need to really know the history of the region. And you asked what courses you should take. If you're interested in Asia, you need to understand the history of China. And I would start with the 100-Year Marathon by Michael Pillsbury to really understand what's going on over there. But you need to understand the region and the culture and take security serious, find fixtures on the ground, but really develop those citizen journalist relationships, and you can really be amazed at the kind of stories that come out of Asia just from people on the ground with what technology is available today. That's really my thoughts on how to get the story.
Todd, what's been your experience with overcoming the barriers to get information out of North Korea? And you do a lot on Russia and the communist nations. So can you give us some insight on how you've been able to break through on that?
Sure. Especially in Eastern Europe. I mean, I don't travel to North Korea, obviously, but in Eastern Europe, you are able to travel, at least before COVID, and build relationships. And people always, leave the country and you can see them in other places possibly. But, we've been extremely active in Ukraine over the last year and brought out a lot of stories. And that was just due to being there and to, letting people know you're really interested in what's going on in their country. All the big papers were there, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, et cetera. But I really felt like they were not digging down and finding the actual things and stories that were going on in the ground. They were really just there to almost push a certain narrative. And once they got that done, they left. So they left so much on the table for other people who are willing to get on the ground and dig to find those stories and get them out. So that's one area we've been really successful in, and also in Central Asia, et cetera.
Well, Todd, we really appreciate the facts you brought to the table through your journalism and through the Washington Times. We have a question here from Roger. Too many journalists these days seem to be doing research using Google instead of going to primary sources, and our global lockdown is not helping with this. What can journalists do to pursue primary sources of original information rather than just rehashing what they see on Google or Facebook?
Well, I would say what I said in the beginning is travel, 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 and go to these areas, spend months there, understand the culture, how they work, and you'll be amazed at, it's plain old how to be a leader, historically, how to win friends and any culture is let them know you care about them and the future of their country and how you can help get information out that they may want to get out. And you'll be amazed at the information that starts flowing to you. But it takes a long-term effort and you have to build that relationship first.
Another question quickly. As a journalist, how do you see the Biden administration going forward in relationship to China or challenges from Russia and North Korea, of course?
Well, I see the Biden administration cracking down on any dissent and repressing journalism, to be frank. I think that they've already talked about, and not just what's coming out of China, which of course is controlled, but they have a narrative they're trying to push. And I think, and it's not really Biden, it's his handlers that will crack down on people who say anything against the official narrative. I think that's quite obvious.
Okay. Well, Todd, we thank you, and please stay with us. We'd like to introduce at this time Mr. Bill Gertz. Bill is an excellent investigative journalist, reporter. He's been all over the world, and he's won the trust of some of the people, highest decision makers in the American government, both in military and with the Congress, as well as the State Department and the White House. He's the author of 8 books, 4 of which are national bestsellers. Most recently, I War and Peace in the Information Age, and a great book that I recommend. I've read it, Deceiving the Sky, Inside Communist China's Drive for Global Supremacy. This came out in 2019. He's a guest lecturer at the FBI National Academy in Quantico, Virginia, the CIA, the National Defense University, Fort McNair, Washington, D.C., and the Brookings Institute, Washington, D.C., former media fellow at the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace at Stanford University. Welcome, Mr. Bill Gertz of the Washington Times.
Thank Mike. Thanks for that introduction. I'd just like to make a few brief remarks, and then we can get to questions. Our topic is covering Asia, getting the story. I'd like to say that Asia has been a central focus of my reporting since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. And I've traveled extensively in the region. I just recently went through my passport and saw the nations that I visited. A couple of notable ones were in 2001, I traveled to Taiwan, where I interviewed the then president, Chen Shui-bian, in his office, which was a pretty good interview, getting the story firsthand from the president of Taiwan and this important democratic state standing off over across the 100-mile strait from China. 2010, I traveled to Hong Kong. Then it was still a vibrant democracy with a vibrant free press. Things have changed dramatically since then. My 2 most recent visits were very notable. One was in June of 2018. I traveled to China with then Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis. And I remember that I lobbied hard to go on that trip. The Pentagon really was concerned. They told me flat out, they said, well, we're not sure the Chinese government would allow you into the country. I have traveled frequently to China, or I should say infrequently, mostly, and in fact, all of my trips have been on official travel. And that is, I've traveled with secretaries of defense going back to the 1990s, and including one vice president trip that was with Vice President Dick Cheney. I traveled to China. And all of these were very important to me because you get a firsthand feet on the ground sense, knowing that China does not look favorably upon my reporting. In fact, in 2006, Xinhua, the official Chinese news agency, described me as the, quote, #1 anti-China expert in the world, which puts me in pretty good company. My retort is that I'm not anti-China. I'm anti-Chinese Communist Party, very much pro-China and pro-Chinese people. So that has been the story that I have been very anxious to get out. That is that the Communist Party of China, the ruling party, is an illegitimate government. It does not represent the 1.4 billion Chinese people. It is, as a party, it has 93 million people, which is a massive, large political party, but they control the military, they control all the sources of information, and getting the story in China has really been a key focus for me. My most recent trip was around the world with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who I would like to proclaim as, in my view, has been one of the best, if not the best, secretaries of state that the United States has ever had. Of course, he's come under vicious attack by Chinese state media, as well as many of the liberal critics here in the United States, including in the foreign policy arena. But I was fortunate enough to be able to travel with Pompeo to India. And then we also traveled to the island nations of Sri Lanka and Maldives, then on to Indonesia, then on to Vietnam, and then finally back to the United States, making a trip around the world. You know, a lot of people have said that during the pandemic that their travel has been restricted. And I found that last year I've traveled more in Asia than at any time in the previous 5 or 6 years. I'd like to say, and again, so some of the countries I've been to Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, Australia, lots of trips to Japan and Korea. And it was during my Korea visits that I did a lot of reporting and got some really good stories, including interviews with U.S. Forces Korea commanders, as well as some real heart-wrenching interviews with North Korean defectors. And this, I think, is one of the most important stories of Asia. And depending on the South Korean government, there has been an ebb and flow in whether or not the government there allows defectors to tell their stories. For many years, the liberal governments in South Korea suppressed defector reporting, and it was under the more conservative governments that they allowed the defectors to have a bigger voice. They allowed them to open up special publications like NK News. I can remember a couple of good interviews. One Mike mentioned early during our fact-finding visit, where I was able to interview one of the key trainers of North Korean hackers. And his message was very clear. He said, you must understand the nature of the threat posed by North Korean information and hacking operations. They are very good at it. They probably learned from the Chinese how to do it. They have multiple ways of deceiving their identities and hiding their identities. So this is an important story that I've covered. Another defector that I also covered was a special forces soldier who provided some amazing information that if you understand North Korean special forces operations, they have a very, very large force of commandos. And this is unusual for most countries. We often talk much about the North Korean nuclear threat, and that is a direct threat to the United States, and it's growing with a number of different missiles, including submarine-launched nuclear missiles. But one of the major threats is their special operations forces, which, if there were a conflict on the Korean Peninsula, would flood the South, conduct decapitation operations against leaders, sabotage to shut down the electrical grid and communications networks and the like. And so this defector that I interviewed told me that even these special operations troops had food shortages, that the food shortages in North Korea were very severe, and that the military really had difficulty even feeding the troops there. This defector tried to get out of North Korea with his family, his wife and his daughter, yet the person that was sponsoring him to defect betrayed him to the border guards, and he ended up stuck in a camp. He told the guard that was holding him to let him go into town to get some cigarettes for him and get some food for his family. And he came back with the food for his family, but didn't get the cigarettes. And then he told the guard, he says, oh, I forgot. And he was going to go. And he left again to get the cigarettes. And he made a decision to leave behind his wife and daughter and flee across the border into China, eventually made it to South Korea. And he was obviously distraught. He had to make this decision whether to save his own life or whether to die with both his family, with his wife and daughter. And now when I interviewed him, he was trying through the South Koreans to get his family out. And so that's the kind of stories that are there in Asia that I've been successful in covering. I would like to make a couple of more comments on China, because China is clearly the big dog in news coverage of Asia right now. And China is becoming so sophisticated with their information and influence operations. And they have succeeded to a very large degree in skewing or obscuring real factual reporting about the nature of the communist system and the kinds of activities that the Chinese government is engaged in. And they do this through a number of ways, but the most important way they do it is by controlling access to China. During the Trump administration, there was a major effort by Secretary of State Pompeo and others to limit and restrict Chinese news, quote, news organizations, which are in effect state-run propaganda outlets. So they began restricting the activities of these news outlets in the United States. And the reason was simple. China uses their news outlets not as independent sources of news and information, but as part of the state's influence operations. And they have been very successful in controlling the public narratives. For example, I've been covering a lot of stories, and one of the most important stories I covered was the fact that Zoom, the massive video conferencing company, was caught. One of their executives, who was fired, was working with Chinese authorities to stifle online meetings of Tiananmen massacre survivors. The Tiananmen massacre being the 1989 effort when they were really close to bringing about a democratic change in China, and the Communist Party called in tanks and troops and crushed it. And this Zoom executive was involved with cutting off live meetings of dissidents in China and around the world. And he also revealed that he was giving Zoom information to the Chinese authorities that they could use to suppress both news reporters and other dissidents. So that's kind of the stories that we're following. Just a couple more points and I'll finish up. China is manipulating coverage of the investigation into the origins of the pandemic. We all know that the pandemic began in Wuhan, and until recently, there have been two competing narratives out there. One is that it was a naturally occurring phenomena. Somehow this virus jumped from a bat to an intermediary animal and then to a human. And the Chinese lie was that this happened at a wet market, a wild animal market in Wuhan. But more and more evidence is coming out now that it actually was part of a virus that was being worked on inside of a high security laboratory in Wuhan called the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And so the World Health Organization tried to get in to China very early on in the pandemic, probably in the March, April timeframe, and they were blocked from getting into the country. When they finally did get in, they were restricted. They were not allowed to interview the doctors who initially blew the whistle on it. And many of the reporters in China who reported on these doctors disappeared and were basically thrown in prison or otherwise silenced by the regime. But now the World Health Organization is currently back inside of China. They were initially blocked and now they're back in, and China is trying to find their theory that this thing came from a wet market has completely collapsed on them because they can't identify the intermediary animal that spread the virus from a bat to a human. So their hope is that to manipulate both the world press and the World Health Organization into finding this, quote, mysterious animal. But unless they allow information from inside the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And I've got a piece coming out tomorrow in the Washington Times, which will identify new intelligence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology is the most likely source for the Wuhan flu that we're now dealing with on a global level. And I can't end without mentioning Hong Kong. Again, I was in Hong Kong. It was a relatively free place. I remember back in 2010, the Chinese were slowly tightening their grip on the press. And I remember talking to a reporter there who said they didn't know the extent of secrecy, censorship. They didn't know where the line was, but they knew that if a reporter crossed the line, they would lose their job. Well, that all changed with the imposition last year of a new national security law, which totally restricted the press. And we saw the most worrisome sign was the arrest of Jimmy Lai, the Apple Daily founder and media mogul in Hong Kong. He's been arrested and charged under the new national security law, and all the press there has been completely suppressed. And it's going to take new and innovative ways to get that information out. I think I'll stop there, and hopefully that will have inspired some questions.
We have several hundred people in the audience here, 100 on Zoom and 200 more on other media. One question came in from Dr. Kim. How can China, or how can America influence China to help with the reunification of Korea? What could possibly be done that would cause China to be supportive of the reunification of Korea?
Well, it's a difficult problem because first of all, China does not want to see the reunification of Korea on Western terms, meaning South Korean, US, Japan terms. And so they have been pretending to go along with efforts to find accommodation between the two sides. But in reality, China has a defense treaty with North Korea. It's not mentioned very often. In fact, many Korea experts try to pretend that it really doesn't exist, but that is a rock solid commitment. And of course, the last time China sent troops into a conflict was during the Korean War. So China's commitment to North Korea has remained strong, although its relations with the Kim Jong-Un regime remain somewhat spotty. My suggestion, and I don't have a good answer for it, is I think that the US and South Korea need to work directly with North Korea, coming to terms on the nuclear and missile talks. I think that and we need to keep China out, and we need to keep Russia out. I'm very concerned that the Biden administration will seek to relaunch the so-called six-party talks. Dealing with North Korea from a negotiating and agreement standpoint has proven to be a fool's errand in the past. North Korea does not consider itself bound by international agreements, as evidenced by the 1994 agreed framework, which was supposed to end their nuclear program in exchange for them getting nuclear technology, supposedly for their civilian energy program. And what did they do? They turned it into a weapons program. And now we've got missiles that can reach most US cities with nuclear warheads in North Korea.
We have a Canadian representative asking a question. Mr. Gertz, how do you see the current crisis with Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou arrested in Canada, and the retribution by China holding two Canadians, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig?
Yeah, the two Michaels. This is what I have written about as China's hostage diplomacy, and it's not a new phenomenon. In my most recent book, Deceiving the Sky, I wrote about the case of a Chinese hacker whose name was Su Bin, and he was based in Vancouver, where currently Meng Wanzhou is being held in temporary custody. And this hacking case was uncovered by US intelligence. They were able to prosecute the case. And at the same time that they prosecuted that case, the Chinese arrested a couple in Harbin. in northern China and held them hostage. And they didn't release them until the case was disposed. And there was pressure. It was a pretty good compromise for the U.S. Su Bin was imprisoned. He was convicted and imprisoned for hacking Boeing and stealing billions of dollars of C-17 technology, which the Chinese were able to put into their own Y-20 transport that's now going to be part of their power projection. But as part of the deal, Su Bin did not have to disclose details about his intelligence operations. Meng Wanzhou is kind of in the same case. This is one of the most significant Chinese princelings. She's the daughter of the founder of Huawei, who is a PLA officer and is a key element of the Chinese Communist Party regime system. And so they have imprisoned and charged the two Michaels with bogus crimes, and they're using that as leverage to try to get Meng released. They have had a number of extradition hearings in Canada. The first one went in favor of the US, and basically she's being charged with illicit funding of Iranian activities in violation of US sanctions. And the Canadian courts have ruled that those sanctions are covered by Canadian law, and that's the first step. Whether she will actually be extradited remains to be seen.
Well, thank you. Can you just, one more question for Bill, and then we'd like to go back to you and Todd together. Why is Huawei a threat? Can you break that down for our viewers in simple terms? Why is Huawei a threat?
Sure. Huawei Technologies is the world's largest telecommunications company, and it has wired and equipped hundreds, perhaps thousands of world communications systems. And what the threat is information and data. China is gathering up massive amounts of data as part of its global strategy of control. The Chinese are exporting their communist system, which is a nuclear-armed communist dictatorship, which is seeking not democratic values, not the concepts of individual liberty, but communist principles. And part of that strategy is to control information. Huawei is a key part of that. Interesting story is that basically Huawei stole the design for its routers and equipment from Cisco Systems, and they're now using that technology to build their networks, and including smartphones. Under Chinese law, Huawei is required to allow the Chinese intelligence service to use its equipment for any type of spying operations. That means that any data, personal data, text, phone messages, anything that passes through Huawei equipment, not only could be intercepted and gathered, will be intercepted and gathered by Chinese intelligence.
Thank you, Bill. Todd and Bill, a couple of questions. One is, what could Kim Jong-Un do to come closer to America, or what would bring him closer to agreeing to cooperate with America for possible economic development of North Korea? Is that a possibility? Todd, any thoughts on that?
Oh, of course, I think it is. I'd love to be a fly on the wall and understand, and maybe Bill knows more than me, but exactly what the deal was that Trump struck with Kim Jong-un, because it obviously worked. There have not been any missile launches since, although he's rattled the cages somewhat, but I do believe it was based on economic development and security concerns for him and his immediate, oligarchy. Bill, what do you think about that?
Well, I think the Trump strategy is working, and that strategy was maximum pressure on North Korea. And the key is that they are not announcing that we want this horrible regime in North Korea, the Kim Jong-un regime, to be ousted, although that would absolutely be the ultimate solution to the threat from North Korea. But what they've done is to focus on the North Korean missile threat, which has greatly expanded over the past 5 to 10 years, to the point where North Korea has unveiled several new long-range road mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles, and equipped with nuclear warheads that can incinerate U.S. cities. So this means if this changes the strategic equation on the Korean Peninsula. In the past, it was always a massive North Korean conventional strike, and I mentioned their special operations forces. But now, if the balloon goes up in Korea, the missiles are going to be fired at the United States, and so that has changed the calculus for the United States. And it remains imperative that the United States find some way to convince North Korea to give up its nuclear missiles, those nuclear missiles. The Kim Jong-il regime agreed to do that and then backed off of that for various reasons. We have not gotten a similar commitment from Kim Jong-un, but really, I think the message is by imposing severe economic constraints on North Korea, specifically targeting the elites, the message to the North Koreans can be, you either give up your nuclear weapons or your regime will perish. And I think that's the most successful way. Right now, the Biden administration is conducting a review. My guess is that they're going to go back to the feckless six-party talks again to bring in the Chinese and the Russians and the Japanese and really just have meaningless talks that will go on and produce nothing. The way to produce results is to have direct talks, South Korea, US, North Korea, and then keep that maximum economic pressure on until they give up their nuclear weapons.
Thank you. Is Kim Jong-un different from his father, Kim Jong-il, and his grandfather, Kim Il-sung? And if so, in what ways? Is he the same, or did his education in Switzerland really change him? What are your thoughts on that, Todd and Bill? Go ahead, Bill, you can go first.
Okay, I'll go first. Sure. Kim Jong-un is the successor to both Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. And he, in fact, has fashioned himself as Kim Il-sung incarnate. In fact, he's even adopted the clothing styles and the hairstyles of his grandfather, and his policies have not really diverged much from those two earlier leaders. He has a kind of a feudal communist system there. It's really run by a small group of elites, and the sole reason for their existence is to remain in power. And when that's understood, I think that you have a better chance of having a better way to deal with North Korea by really understanding that this is an unusual dictatorship that seeks total control and really doesn't care about the Korean people. And that, I think, has been lost in a lot of the debate on Korea, how to engage them, how to deal with them, is that back in 2014, a United Nations Commission did a big human rights study and determined that the North Koreans were engaged in crimes against humanity on a massive scale. And I think that with that as a foundation, there needs to be much more pressure put on the North Korean regime.
Todd, any comment on that? An
Yeah.
additional question?
Yeah, sorry, I had my mute button on there. I completely agree with Bill. I mean, I would add one thing, in that one key also to North Korea is the Russian equation. They are supporting them with fuel. They're allowing their laborers to move up into Siberia and earn money. And so to pressure from the north, meaning finding a way to make, it in Putin's interest that North Korea stops being a thorn in America's side, would be a good strategy as well.
Additional question: when we speak about fuel, the Biden administration, in the first day, President Biden, by executive order, canceled the Keystone pipeline, and now Canada has nowhere to take this oil that it's producing. And what's the possibility that's going to go to China or even North Korea?
This is Todd. I think there's a high possibility. I probably, you have Hunter Biden on his way over there making deals as we speak. And, I think if you've gone through the Hunter Biden laptop, you've known that he is basically compromised by the CCP and his father is the president. So I think that is what's going to happen. And that's probably one reason why they canceled it, in addition to the whole climate change, initiative of the left. So it's the barriers have been removed and Hunter's back in business.
Another question for both of you. What do you think about the mainstream media in the United States right now and the influence of this left-leaning view? Do you think it's actually rooted in the Marxist communist ideology? Is there an ongoing development within the media world of an adherence to materialism, socialism, and even as far as Marxism, to the point that they would believe that America should become socialist? Bill?
Well, I would say clearly, yeah, what has happened to the media in the United States, that it has become highly politicized. And you can see this almost every day. Just today, Politico, 100 people who work for Politico complained that Politico ran a piece by Ben Shapiro, a conservative blogger. And, this is an example of Snowflake Nation. It happened earlier at the New York Times, where they actually fired some of their op-ed people because the newspaper ran an article by Tom Cotton. And the Snowflake staff, politicized woke Snowflake staff at the New York Times, said that they felt threatened because they ran an op-ed by a conservative senator. Recently, Barry Weiss, and I just posted this on social media recently, Barry Weiss was she's a woman editor at the New York Times who quit. And she said the New York Times has just become a propaganda sheet for the left. And whether there are Marxist sympathies or not, I think it's more interwoven and very low key in terms of the progressive left. They don't use the language of Marxists, but they're beginning to. And I think we're beginning to see some of that in most of the media, where they're not just they don't ascribe to the concept of free speech and a free press. They ascribe to the notion that certain views are acceptable and certain views are unacceptable.
Another question is, what's Kim Jong-un's attitude towards China? Historically, the Korean Peninsula, has seen China as an enemy. How does it work now that Kim Jong-un is cooperating with China? Or does he still have misgivings about having to depend on China? Bill?
Well, in my book, Deceiving the Sky, I present a fictional scenario which could actually play out. And in that fictional scenario, it takes place in the future. And in the future, a group of North Korean generals figure out a way to start a world war by firing a missile at China and using their hacking skills to make it look like a U.S. missile. And so that one of their missiles, and the reason they did this was because they believed that China could blow up and kill their leadership. And I mentioned this earlier in another forum, that there was an explosion at a train station in North Korea one time along the route that was taken by the North Korean leader. And it was clearly viewed as a sign by China, to a message to them that if you don't kowtow to Beijing, this is what could happen to your leaders in the future. So there's probably some tensions there. But on the other hand, Mao, way back in the early days of the communist regime, did something very significant, and he sent a number of generals and officers to Korea, and they were married to Korean women. And this was a way to cement the relationship between Korea and China on a military level. So there are many cultural ties between China's military and North Korea's military.
Thank you, Bill and Todd. Final remarks, Todd. We have to conclude now. Unfortunately, we have dozens of more questions, and we'll have to do another webinar together soon. First Todd and then Bill for final comments, and then I'll wrap up.
Yeah, this is Todd. I think to piggyback on what Bill said on the media, I think that's an extremely important point. I think it's bigger than just Marxism. I think the legacy media, for lack of a better word, has made a decision that their bread is going to be buttered by China economically, and therefore they are all on board with this globalist nation, world, which will make American sovereignty disappear, and China will lead. And if you listen to Xi's speech recently, a couple days ago, it's very clear where he's taking this. And I think the media is on board, and that's why it's critical for readers to search out other alternatives and not give these entities eyeballs and clicks, but find other sources like the Washington Times and others to support.
Thank you. Franco from Canada gave a complimentary point about what you were saying. These journalists like Amazon, which owns the Washington Post, are so heavily tied in business with China, it's unlikely that they would really use their media powers to really challenge China on anything. And this is going with a lot of the global corporate world is tied into China more and more. And even with South Korea, when THAAD was actually introduced by America, and it was very difficult for South Korea because China's their biggest trading partner. They immediately stopped all tourism to South Korea, and they punished South Korea tremendously for cooperating with America. So, Bill, any final remarks? And maybe you could also include in your final remarks, what's China's vision for how America would end up in Northeast Asia? What's their hope with America? That America would do what? Go away? Or
Yeah, first of all, the Chinese Communist Party views the United States as its main enemy, and they're doing everything possible to push the United States out of Asia. Basically, they are working on many different levels, including from subversion, from information operations, and the like. The answer to that, as journalists and news reporters, is to tell the truth, to get the facts out there as best as possible. And I think that's really the key. We live in an information age, and we need to tell the truth and in a clear and easily communicated way.
Thank you very much. I'd like to just conclude with a word about our founder, Dr. Hak Ja-han Moon, is the founder of the Washington Times, together with her husband, Reverend Moon, and the founder of the Universal Peace Federation. She was born in Anju, which is north of Pyongyang in North Korea. She escaped as a little girl before the Korean War broke out with her mother and grandmother. But she is totally committed to see peace and peaceful reunification of North and South Korea. So she is also seeing a vision right now very strongly that there's a window of opportunity in this time, that if we engage North Korea with every kind of possible engagement for information, for also dialogue and understanding, as well as also not letting up on the strong sanctions and everything else, there is a window of opportunity. And we want to support that effort with diplomats, members of Congress, and also journalists. We'll be doing more fact finders soon to Korea when COVID lifts. They would like us to be coming there with a delegation every week. So please, help us with that. And your information has been just tremendous today. I'm learning so much from every webinar we're doing. And I want to thank John Fund from the National Review and Todd, and also Bill Gertz. It's really been a great day. I want to turn this back over to Mr. Larry Moffat, who's the Secretary General of the Universal Peace Federation. Larry?
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. This has been Getting the Story in Asia with our guests, Todd Fund, John Fund, Bill Gertz, and Todd Wood. We are here every Tuesday at 2 p.m., so please join us again. There will always be something interesting. Thank you. Bye-bye.